first thing that we talk about is pitch. Okay? Music ultimately starts with a note, right? And a note has a lot of different characteristics to it, but the one we're going to start with is a pitch. Pitch is how high of a note is it, how low. If I sing up here, it's a higher pitch than a low note down here. So pitch can be higher and lower. If you care, pitch actually comes from how many cycles per second does the sound wave recycle. Okay? So a higher pitch has faster cycling of sound waves, and a lower pitch has lower cycling of sound waves. Or slower, excuse me, faster and slower. Does that make sense so far? So if I get the sound waves going really fast, it's high. If I slow them down, it's a low pitch. Yeah? So if you've never heard the term A440, at some point somebody decided that 440 cycles a second, 440 times that the sound wave cycles, we're going to call that an A. And historically, sometimes 440 was the A, sometimes it was 446, sometimes it was 435, but somebody somewhere down the road said somewhere in that range, that note, we're going to call it A. And most of the time people use 440 nowadays. Now if you double the cycles, and instead of 440 you make it 880, it kind of sounds like the same note, but higher. Okay? We're going to unpack this as the thing progresses, but we call this an octave. So you've got a 440 to 880. And we're going to unpack octave a little later in the class, okay? But they kind of sound like the same note. So the trick with theory is that how do we slice up the notes in between? Okay? Now in Western music, we use a 12-tone system. What that means is from one note to its octave above, or from one frequency or cycles to double that frequency, we slice up the in-between in 12 slices. Okay, so we take, this distance and we say, okay, 12 approximately equal slices is going to be all these other notes. So in Western music, we use 12 notes, right? There are other systems of music out there that exist. You don't need to worry about them, but I want you to know that they exist in context. There's probably the second most widely used, which not that much, but in Western music, it's all 12-tone. But in other cultures, especially in Asia, there's an 18-tone system between the octaves. So what happens is if we have a note that the first note is here, and then the next note is 1/12 of the way, and the next note is 2/12 or a sixth of the way, and so forth, they go 1/18 of the way and 2/18. And so notes that we have are in between the cracks of their notes, and their notes are in between the cracks of ours. The net result is it sounds out of tune to our ears. Does that make sense? But to their culture, it's gorgeous and beautiful, okay? So be careful when you start thinking along the lines that things that man has created to define God's sound might be the way God intends it, because that's a preference being made into religious doctrine. That's a cultural bias, not truth. God can work through 18-tone systems that to our ears just sounds horrible, and yet can be just as anointed as something that's 12-tone. Okay? So be careful about putting doctrine on cultural bias. But in this class, and 90% of the music you're ever going to encounter in your life, 12-tone system it is. Okay? Say again? A joyful noise, exactly right. Okay. So now as these 12 tones and pitch goes up and down, thank you, we're going to look at the keyboard first. So I'm going to make my way over to the keyboard right now. And just to glance through at the notes here on page 3, you might think this is super basic. Or you might think, I never understood this before. Bear with me. At some point, it's all going to make sense. Here's the piano keyboard. When you are going towards the right, the pitch gets higher. When you're going to the left, pitch gets lower. Right? So that's a really low note, and that's a slower frequency of the cycles. These are higher frequencies of the cycles. Okay? I'm moving over to the guitar. On the guitar, the pitch is lowest when the string is played open. Okay, so if I just pluck a string, that's the lowest note that guitar will make when the string is tuned to that particular pitch. Okay, Right now, the pitch that we're hearing has to do with how long of the string is vibrating. So it's from this little white line to this little white line, which is off camera, but it's okay, it'll make sense. That's the pitch right there of that length. So if I push my finger down in between a couple of these frets, which are these lines you see, now if I pluck the string, it sounds higher because it's a shorter distance of string that's vibrating, making the cycles cycle faster. So as I go up this direction towards the sound hole, it gets higher. And if I go down to the left, it gets lower. Because the portion of the string that's vibrating is either shorter or longer. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, one thing I want to explain that's still on the guitar that's going to come about, and you'll find that because theory was made by keyboard players, we'll spend a little more time over here on this side of the room because it's a little harder to explain the guitar fretboard, okay? But as we're going through this, you guys are the viewer, and so you see the guitar as this looking like it's the top string and this looking like it's the bottom string, right? But the player is looking down like this, and now this looks like my top string and this looks like my bottom string. You guys are the viewer. It looks like the open strings here are to your right and the sound hole is to your left, and yet it's opposite from the player's perspective. So most of the time when we talk about guitar, we're talking about it from the player's perspective. So you got to keep that in mind the whole time. And if you're not used to that, it's going to confuse you a couple of times. Don't worry, it kind of confuses everybody. But when I say I'm going to play the top string, if I don't specify player's perspective or viewer's perspective, I'm usually talking players, which means I'm playing this string here, because that's the top string from where I'm sitting. You're looking at it and going, wait, that's the bottom string. Okay, but we've had this conversation, and so now you know. Make sense? So here's the top string. Here's the top string open. Here's the bottom string open. Here's the bottom string fretted and a little higher. Does that make sense? So player's perspective versus viewer's perspective. Any questions?